In a bustling airport filled with unfamiliar faces, the father stepped off the plane, clutching his children's hands tightly. The overwhelming noise of conversations, announcements over the intercom, and the hurried pace of travelers added to his growing sense of unease. His wife stood beside him, equally disoriented by the foreign surroundings. Signs in English flashed overhead, and he could only guess at their meaning. He glanced at his children, who, though tired, looked around wide-eyed at their new world. The journey had been long, not just the flight, but the years leading up to this moment. The decision to leave everything behind and seek a new life in a land where he didn't speak the language had been daunting. Now, standing in the middle of this airport, it felt as if the weight of that decision was finally sinking in. He had dreamed of giving his children a better future, but the enormity of the challenges ahead loomed large. They moved through customs, trying to make sense of the process through gestures and hesitant words. Each interaction felt like a hurdle. Simple tasks that he had once taken for granted, handing over a passport, answering basic questions, had become sources of anxiety. The customs officer said something to him that he couldn't quite grasp, and after a few awkward moments of silence, the officer gestured them through. A wave of relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. There would be many more hurdles to come. Once they had collected their bags, they found themselves standing outside the airport, staring at the unfamiliar streets and the fast-moving cars. His wife's gaze met his, a silent exchange of concern. The children fidgeted, and the father knew that they were tired and hungry. He felt a pang of guilt. This was supposed to be the start of something better, yet here they were, lost in a city they didn't understand. A distant relative had arranged for them to stay in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The father hailed a cab with some difficulty, pointing at the address written on a piece of paper. The driver nodded, and they were on their way. As they drove through the city, the father peered out the window at the blur of buildings, billboards, and signs, all written in English. It was like staring at a wall of incomprehension. When they arrived at the apartment, he carried the bags up the narrow stairs while his wife led the children inside. The apartment was cramped and sparsely furnished, but it was a roof over their heads. As his wife began unpacking, the father walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. Cars honked, people hurried along the sidewalks, and life moved at a pace that felt dizzying. He couldn't help but feel disconnected, like an outsider looking in on a world that didn't belong to him. That night, as the children slept in their shared room and his wife sat beside him on the small bed, the father lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with thoughts of the future. How would they manage? How would he provide for his family in a place where he couldn't even ask for directions? The language barrier felt like an insurmountable obstacle. He could sense his wife's worrying, though she tried to hide it. She placed her hand on his arm, a small gesture of reassurance, but he knew they both felt the same fear. The next morning, after a restless night, the father set out to find work. He walked through the neighborhood, his eyes scanning for any sign of opportunity. Help-wanted signs appeared in shop windows, but each one was accompanied by words he couldn't read or understand. He felt a growing frustration, knowing that without English, his chances were slim. He entered a small cafe, and after a brief exchange of confused glances with the cashier, was handed a job application. Sitting at a table, he stared at the form, the words blurring into a mass of incomprehensible letters. Other customers chatted around him, effortlessly speaking the language that eluded him. A kind-looking woman at a nearby table noticed his struggle and approached him, offering to help. She spoke slowly, pointing to the sections of the form, but the father's embarrassment outweighed his gratitude. He mumbled a thanks, gathered his things, and left the cafe, feeling defeated. Back at the apartment, his children greeted him eagerly, asking if he had found work. He avoided their gaze, his heart sinking. How could he explain to them that he wasn't even close? His oldest child, a bright and curious girl, mentioned hearing kids at school speaking English. "It's like they're in a different world," she said, her voice tinged with confusion and sadness. The father felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had brought them here for a better life, but instead, they were drifting into a place where they felt even more out of place. As the days passed, the father's desperation grew. He knew that learning English was no longer just about finding work, it was about giving his children a future. He couldn't bear the thought of them feeling as lost as he did. One morning, while walking aimlessly through the city, he stumbled upon a community center. A sign outside advertised free English classes for immigrants. He watched as people, much like him, entered the building, some with nervous expressions, others with determined strides. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of uncertainty and hope. Immigrants from all over the world sat in a small classroom, their faces reflecting the same struggles he felt. He listened as the instructor guided them through basic phrases, patiently correcting their pronunciation. For the first time since arriving, the father felt a glimmer of hope. He enrolled in the class that day, knowing that this was the first step toward breaking down the wall that separated him from his new life. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, practicing the simple phrases he had learned, "Hello," "Thank you," "I'm looking for work," his children watched him with curiosity. His oldest daughter smiled, repeating the words after him, her enthusiasm lighting up the room. His wife joined them, offering encouragement. In that moment, the father realized that learning English wasn't just his struggle, it was their collective journey. As the first week of classes came to an end, the father felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. Each small victory, understanding a word, greeting a neighbor, recognizing a sign at the grocery store, gave him strength. He knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time, he believed that he could make it, not just for himself, but for his family. The father entered the classroom for his first English lesson, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. The small room was filled with immigrants like him, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles. Some smiled at him in recognition, but no words were exchanged, just nods and glances of understanding. He took a seat near the back, feeling both eager and out of place. The teacher, a kind-looking woman with a gentle demeanor, began speaking, and immediately the father felt a rush of confusion. The words were foreign, unfamiliar, and fast. She introduced herself and then wrote her name on the board. "Hello, my name is Ms. Wilson." The father stared at the letters, trying to connect the sounds to their shapes. The class followed along as M's. Wilson began the lesson by going over simple greetings. "Hello, good morning, how are you?" The father repeated the words under his breath, trying to mimic her pronunciation. Each sound felt strange in his mouth, like learning to speak all over again. As the class progressed, the father couldn't help but notice that some of his classmates seemed to grasp the language more quickly. A few even spoke up, answering Ms. Wilson's questions with halting but understandable English. He felt a twinge of embarrassment. How were they learning so quickly? His mind raced with self-doubt, but he forced himself to stay focused. He had come here with a purpose, and he wasn't about to let these feelings of inadequacy stop him. At the end of the class, Ms. Wilson handed out a worksheet with basic phrases and vocabulary. The father took it home, determined to practice. That night, after the children had gone to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the worksheet in front of him. He repeated the words aloud over and over again until his voice was hoarse. His wife sat across from him, watching with a mixture of concern and admiration. She didn't speak, but her presence was a quiet reminder of why he was doing this for their future, for their children. The next day, the father walked through the neighborhood, practicing the phrases as he passed people on the street. "Good morning," he whispered to himself. "How are you?" He longed for the day, and he would have the confidence to say these words out loud to a stranger without fear of stumbling or being misunderstood. But that day still felt far away. Later that week, during his second class, the father felt a small flicker of progress. Wilson asked the class to introduce themselves using the simple sentence structure they had learned. "My name is ... She pointed to the father, encouraging him to try. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he feared the words wouldn't come. But then he spoke, slowly and carefully. "My name is ... double quotes." He paused, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on him. "My name is ... double quotes." And then, finally, his name, Luis. The room erupted into quiet applause, and for the first time since arriving in this new country, the father felt a sense of accomplishment. It was a small victory, but it was enough to rekindle his hope. He wasn't fluent, not by a long shot, but he had spoken, he had communicated. Even if only for a brief moment, it was a start. As the weeks went by, the father continued his routine. Every morning, he attended the English classes, and every night he practiced at home. His children began to take an interest in his learning. His oldest daughter would sit beside him at the table, helping him go over his vocabulary words. Sometimes she would giggle at his mispronunciations, but it was always with affection. These moments brought a sense of unity to their family, a shared purpose that went beyond the language barrier. One afternoon, the father decided to put his learning to the test. He walked into a small grocery store determined to buy a few items using the English he had learned. As he approached the cashier, he felt his palms began to sweat. He rehearsed the words in his head. I would like to buy ... double quotes. When it was his turn, he handed the cashier the items and, with a deep breath, said, I would like to buy this. The cashier smiled and responded, but the father didn't catch the words. Panic set in. He asked the cashier to repeat, but again the rapid English was too much for him to follow. Embarrassed, he handed over some money, not sure if it was the right amount, and left the store feeling defeated. It was a reminder that he still had a long way to go. His progress in class had given him confidence, but the real world was much less forgiving. He returned home that evening, his spirits low. His children could sense his frustration, and his youngest daughter, sensing his distress, climbed into his lap and hugged him. Her simple gesture of love reminded him that this journey wasn't just about him, it was about them. The next day, back in class, the father found it hard to focus. Wilson could tell something was wrong. After class, she approached him and asked if he needed help with anything. He hesitated, but eventually explained his frustration and not being able to communicate in the grocery store. Ms. Wilson nodded sympathetically. It's okay to make mistakes, she told him. Learning a language is like learning anything else. It takes time and it takes practice. Don't give up. Her words resonated with him. He realized that his setbacks didn't mean failure, they were part of the process. That evening, at the kitchen table, he picked up his worksheet again. This time his children joined him, repeating the words with him. Together they laughed, stumbled, and learned. In those moments, the father felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just learning English for himself, he was learning it for them, for their future. As the days turned into weeks, the father noticed small changes. He could understand a little more each time he went to the store, and he began to greet neighbors with a simple hello. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Each small victory gave him the strength to keep going, even when the road ahead seemed long. In class, the father continued to improve. Wilson praised his determination, and the father started to believe that he could truly learn this language. He still had moments of doubt, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. His children continued to support him, and their encouragement made all the difference. By the end of the second month, the father could introduce himself without hesitation, ask basic questions, and even hold brief conversations with Ms. Wilson during class. He knew he still had much to learn, but he also knew that he was on the right path. For the first time since arriving in this new land, he felt a sense of belonging, not because he had mastered the language, but because he was no longer afraid to try. As the father began his third month of English classes, the rhythm of his daily life started to change. He felt a growing sense of independence with each small success. One morning, while standing at the bus stop, he realized he no longer needed to rely on the kindness of strangers to help him figure out which bus to take. He could read the signs, understand the schedules, and even greet the bus driver with a confident "good morning." This small victory felt monumental, a sign that the language he once feared was slowly becoming familiar. His children noticed the change as well. At home, they asked him about the new words he was learning. His eldest daughter especially showed an interest in his progress, often sitting beside him at the kitchen table while he practiced his vocabulary. She would quiz him on common phrases and laugh with him when he stumbled over a difficult word. These moments of shared learning brought them closer, and the father felt a deep sense of pride. He was not only learning for himself, but for his family's future. One day, after class, the father decided to take a bold step. He had seen a sign for a job opening at a small grocery store near his apartment. It wasn't much a part-time position stocking shelves, but it was a chance to prove to himself that he could function in this new world. Armed with the confidence from his recent language classes, he walked into the store and approached the manager. The conversation started smoothly enough. "I would like to apply for the job," he said, his heart racing. The manager, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, handed him an application form. As the father sat down to fill it out, his hands shook slightly. The words on the form were familiar, but he still struggled with their meaning. He paused at several sections, unsure of how to answer. When he returned the form to the manager, she glanced over it and asked a question he didn't fully understand. The father's face flushed with embarrassment, and he stammered, "I'm sorry. Can you say again?" The manager repeated herself more slowly, but the words still didn't make sense. He felt the familiar frustration rising in his chest, but before he could apologize and leave, the manager smiled and said, "It's okay. We can work through it together." The father left the store that day without a job offer, but with something even more valuable, a sense of perseverance. He hadn't succeeded this time, but he hadn't failed either. He had tried, and that, he realized, was the most important thing. As he walked home, he felt lighter. The fear of speaking, the fear of making mistakes, it was all starting to fade. He wasn't perfect, but he was improving. Back at the apartment, the father's children gathered around the table for their usual evening routine. Tonight, though, the atmosphere felt different. His daughter, noticing the shift in his mood, asked if something had happened. The father hesitated for a moment before sharing the story of his job interview attempt. His daughter listened carefully, and when he finished, she smiled at him and said, "You'll get it next time, Papa. You just have to keep trying." Her words, simple and sincere, filled him with a renewed sense of determination. She was right, he just had to keep trying. The following day, the father returned to his English class with a new sense of purpose. He had made a commitment to his family, and he wasn't about to let them down. The lessons were still challenging, but now he saw each challenge as an opportunity to grow. During one class, Ms. Wilson asked the students to practice introducing themselves in a more conversational tone. The father took a deep breath and raised his hand. "Hello," he began, his voice steady. "My name is Luis. I am learning English. It is not easy, but I want to learn so I can work and take care of my family." His classmates clapped softly, and Ms. Wilson nodded approvingly. The father felt a rush of pride. It was the longest sentence he had spoken in English, and though it wasn't perfect, it had been understood. That was enough. After class, one of his fellow students, a man from a neighboring country, approached him. "Good job," the man said in broken English. "We learned together." The father smiled and nodded, grateful for the camaraderie that was beginning to form among the students. As the weeks went on, the father found himself taking on more responsibility at home as well. His wife, who had been managing most of the household tasks, began to notice his growing confidence and encouraged him to help with more of the daily chores. He started teaching his children some of the English words he had learned, reversing the roles for the first time. His children looked up to him with admiration, proud of the progress he had made. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the father's youngest son asked him to teach them how to say certain phrases in English. The father smiled and obliged, teaching them simple greetings and phrases. It was a joyful moment, one that reminded him why he had embarked on this journey in the first place. His children's laughter and curiosity were the driving forces behind his determination. With each passing day, the father's confidence grew. He no longer hesitated when greeting neighbors or speaking to the bus driver. He began to feel more comfortable in his own skin, no longer weighed down by the fear of not being understood. His progress was slow but steady, and with each small victory, he felt more at home in this foreign land. By the end of the third month, the father decided to take on more hours at the community center's English classes. He was determined to improve rapidly, knowing that the more he learned, the more opportunities would open up for him and his family. The path ahead was still long, but he no longer felt overwhelmed by it. He had come too far to turn back now. The father's journey was far from over, but he was beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. His children, once uncertain and restless, now looked to him with hope. They saw in him a man who refused to give up, no matter how difficult the road became. And in their eyes he saw the future. He had always dreamed of a future, for they could thrive in this new world, unburdened by the barriers that had once held them back. As the father's English classes continued, he began to notice a significant shift in his ability to understand conversations around him. Words that once seemed like an impenetrable wall were now forming into sentences that made sense. His confidence grew with each class, and he found himself participating more frequently, even if his English was still broken and hesitant. The teacher, Ms. Wilson, had noticed his progress and often encouraged him with a warm smile or a nod of approval. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and that was what mattered. One afternoon, after a particularly successful class, the father received some unexpected news. He had applied for a part-time position at a local grocery store weeks ago, not expecting much to come of it. But to his surprise, the store manager had left a message for him at the community center. He was being offered a chance to work, even if just for a few hours a week. The father's heart raced with a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to prove that he could make a life for himself and his family in this new land. When he arrived at the grocery store for his first day of work, the father was greeted by the same manager who had helped him fill out the job application. Her kindness had stayed with him, and now, as she walked him through the tasks he would be responsible for, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Stocking shelves, cleaning aisles, and greeting customers, all of it was within his reach, and the best part was that it didn't require much talking. Still, he knew that he would need to practice his English as much as possible if he wanted to truly succeed here. The father worked diligently, determined to show that he was reliable and hardworking. Even though his shifts were short, the sense of pride he felt when he returned home at the end of each day was immense. His children would greet him with wide smiles, asking about his day in English, practicing the language alongside him. He could see the curiosity in their eyes and the joy they felt in sharing this journey with him. It wasn't just his struggle anymore, it was theirs too, and together they were learning and growing. However, the new job brought its own challenges. Between his work and his English classes, the father found himself with little time to spend with his family. His wife, who had always been patient and supportive, began to express concern. She noticed how tired he looked in the evenings, how his eyes seemed heavier with each passing day. One night, as they sat together after the children had gone to bed, she voiced her worries. "You're doing too much," she said softly, her hand resting on his arm. "I'm proud of you, but you need to rest. The children miss you, and I'm worrying that you're pushing yourself too hard." The father listened, knowing she was right. The weight of balancing work, family, and language learning was becoming more than he had anticipated. He didn't want to admit it, but the long hours were starting to take their toll. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the only way to move forward. He needed to learn English, to work, to provide for his family. The pressure was immense, and he felt caught between his responsibilities and his well-being. Days passed, and the father continued to push himself, despite his growing fatigue. He attended every class, worked every shift, and did his best to be present for his family in the few hours they had together, but the exhaustion was starting to show. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table reviewing his English notes, he could barely keep his eyes open. His children, who had grown used to sitting with him during these study sessions, noticed his struggle. His eldest daughter, always observant, spoke up. "Papa, maybe you should take a break tonight. You've been working so hard." The father looked at her young face filled with concern. For a moment, he considered pushing through, telling her that he needed to keep going, but something in her eyes made him pause. He realized that if he continued at this pace, he might not be able to give them the attention they needed. He nodded slowly, closing his notebook. "You're right," he said softly. "I think I need a rest." That night, for the first time in weeks, the father allowed himself to relax. He sat with his children, listening to their stories from school, laughing at their jokes, and enjoying the warmth of their company. It was a small moment of peace amidst the chaos of their new life, but it reminded him of what truly mattered. He was doing all of this for them, and if he wasn't careful, he might lose sight of that. The next day, he spoke with Ms. Wilson after class, sharing his concerns about balancing work, family, and learning. Ms. Wilson, ever compassionate, listened carefully before offering her advice. "You're doing something remarkable," she said, "but you have to take care of yourself, too. It's okay to take things one step at a time. You've made incredible progress, and that's something to be proud of. Don't forget that." Her words stayed with him. The father realized that while he wanted to give his family everything, he needed to pace himself. His progress in learning English had been steady, and he was proud of how far he had come. But he also needed to find a balance that would allow him to continue without burning out. Over the next few weeks, the father made small changes. He adjusted his work hours slightly, giving himself more time to rest and spend with his family. He still attended his English classes, but he no longer pushed himself to the point of exhaustion. With each adjustment, he found that his energy returned and his connection with his family deepened. His wife noticed the change, and the worrying that had clouded her eyes began to fade. Despite the challenges, the father felt a renewed sense of hope. He had found a rhythm that worked for him, one that allowed him to continue growing without sacrificing the things that mattered most. His journey was far from over, but he was no longer rushing to reach the end. He was learning to appreciate the process, to celebrate the small victories along the way. One evening, as the father walked home from work, he reflected on how much had changed since their arrival in this new country. The fear and uncertainty that had once consumed him had given way to determination and resilience. He was no longer a stranger in a foreign land, but a man who was carving out a place for himself and his family. The road ahead was still long, but with each step he was getting closer to the life he had dreamed of for them. When he arrived home at night, his children greeted him with their usual enthusiasm, their laughter filling the small apartment. The father smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. He had learned that success wasn't just about how quickly he could adapt or how many hours he could work. It was about finding balance, taking care of himself and his family, and trusting that with time, everything would fall into place. The father sat quietly in the classroom, his eyes fixed on the certificate in his hands. It had been months since he first stepped into the community center, filled with fear and uncertainty, unsure if he could ever grasp the language that had felt so foreign to him. But now here he was, holding proof of his progress, proof that he had made it through the challenges, that he had endured the long nights of studying and the daily struggles of navigating a new life in a foreign land. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a symbol of his resilience. His classmates clapped softly as each of them received their certificates, M's. Wilson beamed with pride, offering words of encouragement to everyone. When it was the father's turn, she handed him the certificate with a warm smile. "You've worked so hard for this," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I hope you're proud of yourself." The father nodded, but he struggled to find the right words to express his gratitude. His English had improved significantly, but moments like these still overwhelmed him. He simply smiled back, feeling the weight of her words settle in his heart. He was proud, not only for himself but for his family. This was for them. As the ceremony came to an end, the father gathered his things and walked home. The evening air was cool, and the streets were quieter than usual. With each step, he thought about how far he had come. He remembered the first time he had tried to introduce himself in class, how nervous and out of place he had felt. He thought about the times he had fumbled through conversations, embarrassed by his mistakes, unsure if he would ever feel comfortable speaking this new language. And now, though he wasn't perfect, he had learned to communicate, to understand, to make his way in this new world. When he reached the apartment, his children greeted him with eager faces. They knew what tonight meant. They had been waiting for this moment as much as he had. His eldest daughter rushed to him first, her eyes shining with pride. "Did you get it, Papa?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. The father smiled and held up the certificate. "I did," he said, his voice steady. His children gathered around him, admiring the paper as if it were a treasure. His wife stood nearby, watching them with quiet joy. She hadn't said much during the past few weeks, but the father could see the relief in her eyes. This was as much her victory as it was his. That evening, they celebrated with a simple dinner. It wasn't extravagant, but it was filled with laughter and warmth. For the first time in a long while, the father felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He had proven to himself and to his family that they could build a life here, that they could belong. The following week, with his certificate in hand, the father returned to the grocery store where he had been working part-time. He approached the manager with a newfound sense of confidence. "I've completed my English classes," he said, his words clear and measured. "I'm ready to work full-time now, if you'll have me." The manager smiled, impressed by his determination. "You've come a long way," she said. "We'd be happy to have you on full-time." The father's heart swelled with gratitude. It was the break he had been waiting for, a chance to provide stability for his family, to give them the life he had promised when they first arrived in this country. He thanked the manager, shaking her hand firmly, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. In the days that followed, the father settled into his new routine. He worked full-time at the grocery store, but unlike before, he no longer felt the weight of the language barrier holding him back. He was able to communicate with customers, understand his tasks, and navigate the daily interactions with ease. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And each day, he grew more confident, more comfortable in his role. His children continued to thrive as well. They had adapted to school, making friends, and learning the language with the ease that only children seem to possess. The father watched them with pride, knowing that their future was bright because of the sacrifices he had made. He had given them the opportunity to succeed in a place that had once seemed so far out of reach. One evening, as the father sat at the kitchen table with his children, helping them with their homework, he realized how much had changed. They were speaking English fluently now, their sentences flowing easily. His youngest son asked him a question about a math problem, and the father answered without hesitation, slipping into English as naturally as if he had been speaking it his whole life. It was in that moment that he truly understood the magnitude of what he had achieved. He had crossed a barrier that had once seemed insurmountable. He had learned a new language, found a job, and created a home for his family in a place that had once felt so foreign. And now he was passing on what he had learned to his children, helping them build the future he had dreamed of. As the months passed, the father found himself taking on a new role in the community. Other immigrants who were just starting their journey would come to him for advice, seeking guidance on how to navigate the challenges of learning English and building a life in a new country. The father, once so unsure of himself, now spoke with confidence. He shared his story, offering words of encouragement and hope just as Ms. Wilson had done for him. In time, the father became a mentor to others, helping them find their way through the same struggles he had faced. It was a role he never expected, but one that filled him with a deep sense of purpose. He had come so far, and now he could help others do the same. On a crisp autumn morning, the father walked his children to school, his youngest daughter holding his hand tightly. As they approached the school gates, she looked up at him with a smile. "Papa, do you think I'll be as good at English as you one day?" she asked. The father chuckled softly, bending down to kiss her on the forehead. "You're already better than me," he said, his voice filled with love. "And you will go even further." As he watched his children disappear into the schoolyard, the father stood for a moment, taking it all in. The journey had been long, and there had been moments when he had doubted himself, moments when the fear and uncertainty had felt overwhelming. But now, as he stood there, he knew that it had all been worth it. He had given his family the life he had promised, and more importantly, he had given them the tools to thrive in this new world. They were no longer outsiders, they belonged. And as the father turned to walk back home, his heart full, he knew that the future, once filled with uncertainty, was now bright with promise. So what did you think of this story about Luis and his experience of learning English with his family? Did you find it easy to understand? Was the English level just right for you? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to check out more of our stories on this channel. They're a great way to improve your understanding of English while enjoying emotional and relatable experiences. Don't worry, at the end of this video, we'll have another suggestion just for you, so you can keep watching and learning. Thank you for being here, and remember, the more you practice, the better you'll get. Keep watching, and you'll see your English improve day by day.